Hello everyone, and welcome to our Safe Landing Lunch and Learn today. And we're going to be joined by Transport and Environment, who will be presenting for us on ultrafine particles, or also known as UFPs. My name's Todd. I'm a former airline pilot and member of Safe Landing. And Safe Landing is essentially a group of aviation workers, both inside and outside of the sector, who are campaigning for to support the aviation transition and make sure that workers have their voices heard, and moving beyond the short-term thinking of both board members and politicians. So if you are watching this for the first time or catch up, then we'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'll hand over to is it Christina or Carlos is starting us off?
I think I can be the first one.
Oh, thank you.
Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're currently at. So my name is Christina, and together with my colleague Carlos, we are going to present you our study that we have recently published together with CE Delft. Maybe a quick intro for myself. So I have joined Transport and Environment approximately 6 months ago, and before that I worked for an airline called Wizz Air. So I think I can be considered myself as a former aviation sector employee. So maybe without further ado, I will try to share my screen and show you our presentation. Hopefully it works. For me, it says loading. I hope it will.
Yeah, still loading here also. There we go.
Can you see it? Okay, great. What we're going to present to you today is this study that we did together with CE Delft. And the idea was that we look into a bit more to the health impact of aviation. Transport and Environment is a clean mobility campaigning organization. So our focus mostly is on the climate impact of different modes of transport, including aviation. But this time we thought we can look into the health impact of aviation. The study that we commissioned from CE Delft focuses mainly on one type of pollutant called ultrafine particles. And the reason behind is, on the one hand, UFPs, they are linked to certain illnesses, or the increased risk related to those illnesses. And also because this is an under researched area of study. There are a lot of studies out there with regard to for example, the noise pollution from aviation, but for some reason UFPs remained under the radar. So, and as part of our study, we also looked into ways on can be reduced as well. So what we looked into in our study is the 32 busiest airports in Europe, meaning they looked at those airports that you can see on the map. That includes the EU, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK as well. And we looked at a 20-kilometer radius around those busy airports, which means that over 51 million people that are living in those airports. So we are talking about approximately 10% of the population of the EU, to put it into perspective. Since a lot of people in the call are from the aviation sector or somehow worked in the sector, it is important to note that the study does not look specifically to airport workers. And the reason being is that there are not really comparable studies out there. And I know that we have a gentleman from the Dutch Schiphol union. So I would be curious to hear his views afterwards. But what we see is that there are not in general, not many studies out there on UFPs, none of them at the EU level. So what we tried to do with this study is to gather data that was out there, which were many like sporadical few measurements here and there, and try to translate it to the EU level in terms of numbers. So the context of the study is basically linking aviation emissions and health. And we all know that aircraft emit all types of pollutants. And as I mentioned before, the climate impact with the CO2 is quite known. That is less true for the health impact. And even though especially with the ultrafine particles that my colleague Carlos will discuss more in detail later in this presentation, there is a clear link between the health impact of ultrafine particle emissions of aircraft, and yet this has not been in depth studied and researched. We also found in the study, and again Carlos will talk more about this in detail, that the pollutants that aircraft emit depend strongly on the composition of the aviation fuel used. So this is something we looked at also, how by changing the aviation fuel, these emissions can be reduced. And then I think that's the point when I'm giving the floor to my colleague Carlos to talk a bit more detail about UFPs and non-CO2 emissions.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, everyone. Short intro from my side. My name is Carlos. I work for TNE. I've been here for a bit more than 2 years now. And before that, I used to work for Airbus. So I'm also a former aviation industry employee. I still consider myself in a way an aviation industry employee, just in a slightly different side. But at the end of the day, we're trying to get the industry to transition to clean solutions as soon as possible. So going into the detail of the presentation, Christina has given already some context. First, a very brief overview of non-CO2 emissions, although I'm sure that most of you, if not all, know this very well. But CO2 emissions from aviation are discussed a lot in detail, but not everyone knows that there are many other emissions from aviation which do have an impact on air quality and on the climate as well. We're talking about gases, but also particles. And within the particles, as we've mentioned before, we're focusing in this study on ultrafine particles. Next slide, please, Christina.
Sorry, Carlos, it's not moving, but I'm on it.
Okay, no worries. There's a bit of an animation, so you may need to click twice. There you go. So yeah, what are ultrafine particles? As the name suggests, they're really, really small, but just how small? They have a diameter of less than 100 nanometers. To put that in perspective, it's more than 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. And that means they can get really deep into the body. So they can get either into the bloodstream through the pulmonary cells, so they get really deep, and where the gas exchange between the lungs and the blood happens, those particles get through that, but they can also get into the brain through the olfactory nerve. So they're really, really small, and that makes them particularly dangerous. Next slide, please. So if you can click a few times. So why the focus on ultrafine particles? Christina has given already a brief overview before. They're a pollutant of emerging concern. The fact that they're very small makes them dangerous, but also very difficult to detect. That's why today, unfortunately, they're not regularly monitored. Neither there are legal limits. Aircraft, big emitters of ultrafine particles, more so than other means of transportation. And finally, we saw that there was a bit of a gap when it came to understanding the issue. It's being under researched, as Christina has mentioned, and there are mostly local studies around individual airports, but we realized there was a bit of a gap when it came to having a comprehensive study providing a bit of an overall view. So that's what we wanted to do with this one. Next slide, please. So what did we do? How did we go from one study to getting a bit of an overview of the problem of those 32 business airports? We started from a study around Schiphol Airport carried out by the RIVM, well-established Dutch organization, which looked into the impact of ultrafine particles from aviation, specifically around the airport of Schiphol, which is one of the busiest around Europe. So this study estimated the concentrations of ultrafine particles from aviation around Schiphol. It also took and then associated it to a potential number of conditions uh, of the population living near it. So as Christina has mentioned before, the focus was on surrounding populations. There wasn't a particular focus on the workers of the airport in this study. Next slide, please. This study concluded that there were a number of conditions for which we could see a strong correlation between the concentrations of UFPs and the risks of those conditions. And those are high blood pressure, diabetes, and dementia. There was a probable possible correlation with other conditions, but we did not consider those for this study because we want to quantify the effects. So we could only quantify the effects for those conditions with a strong correlation, where you have a figure here, as you can see, for high blood pressure, diabetes, dementia, an extra 5, 8, 14, 16% of risk from self-reports of the local population. So next slide, please. What the study did, we took the estimated UFPs concentrations from Schiphol, we correlated it to the air traffic from Schiphol, and then we extrapolated to other airports. So that means if an airport has half of the air traffic from Schiphol, the estimated UFP concentration will be half of that of the Dutch airport. Then with that UFP concentration, we know the correlation between the UFP exposure and the risk of those conditions we've seen before. So that's the increased risk of suffering those conditions. And we overlapped those risks associated to the UFP concentrations to the population density around each of the 32 airports in the study, which is what you can see on the right-hand side of the map. And with that, finally, we estimated the number of people potentially affected by those conditions. So next slide, please. That's the result we came to when we applied the methodology in the previous slide. So we estimated that due to this ultrafine particle exposure, we could be looking at an increased number of cases of 280,000 for high blood pressure, 330,000 diabetes cases, and 18,000 dementia cases around those 32 airports, among those 50 million people that we looked at in Europe, due to ultrafine particle exposure from aviation. If we move to the next slide. So after having an idea of the size of the problem, we looked at the potential solution, which is clean jet fuel. Maybe a quick word before talking about this cleaner jet fuels. The aim of the study was to give a first order estimate of the issue. The aim of the study is not to tell there are 18,200 cases of this condition around that airport. We're 100% sure. First, it's very difficult to do that in medical studies. So we know that we're always talking about increased risks. We talk about probable links, but we're not yet at the point where we can attribute a cause-effect relationship. We do have strong correlation though, and that's what we want to do. But in general, in health studies, we're always talking about risks. And second, for this particular problem, it's a very nascent area. So unfortunately, today we do not have a lot of literature. So we've done the best we could with the little available information. Still, the assumptions we've made, we are convinced that this is a good estimate of the size of the problem. So we wanted to convey that message. This is an estimate. This is an important problem. We can't say it's 330,000, 342, 317, but the ballpark is there. It's a big problem. We need to do something about it. So I just wanted to clarify that point. Moving on to the next point, which is one of the possible solutions of this problem that we wanted to explore. It's cleaner fuels. As Christina's mentioned before, we know and many tests show that there's a link between particle emissions and the composition of fuel, particularly between with regards to two specific components, which are aromatic compounds and sulfur. So we know that cleaner fuels, meaning fuels with lower aromatic content and fuels with lower sulfur content as well, do emit fewer particles, as we can see here in the screen. So we know that certain types of SAF, such as HEFA SAF, have very low or no aromatic components or sulfur. And what you can see in the screen is a combustion test performed in an APU with 100% SAF, sorry, 100% fossil kerosene on the left-hand side at 0, and then increasing blends of SAF up to 100%. And what we can see is that we decrease the mass and number of particles by 90% and 70% respectively. So those are, the more HEFA you use, the less aromatics and the less SAF you have in the fuel you're using in your engine, the fewer emissions, both in terms of mass and particles. So next slide, please. So what we did, basically, the study assumes that there's a direct link between particle number reduction and risk reduction of for the health conditions we've seen before. So the cleaner fuels we use, meaning the fewer aromatics and sulfur in the fuel, the fewer particles, and the fewer associated health risks. And there are two ways of achieving those reductions. On the one hand, we could use increasing amounts of SAF. We're killing two birds with one stone because we're reducing the climate impact and we're also reducing particle emissions. But I think most of us, or all of us, know that SAFs are unfortunately not really available today. And it's going to take quite some time for them to scale up to important quantities. So that's why, to bridge the gap between now and say 50 or 100% SAF in still decades, there's an opportunity, which is to hydrate fossil jet fuel. And this is not rocket science. This is something which has been done for decades in road transport fuels and for some years now as well for shipping fuels, which is simply to add a bit of hydrogen in a refining process so that we can quickly reduce sulfur, and also we can reduce the aromatic compounds, especially naphthalene, which are the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are the most detrimental to emissions. We can achieve that applying the same processes which have been applied for decades to road fuels at a very low cost as well. So we're talking about less than 5 cents per liter. Those are the best estimates that we have right now. For comparison, that will be an extra 5 to 10% in the cost of fuel, comparing to 2, 3, 5 times, even 10 times the cost of fossil kerosene, which is the cost of SAF today. So it's a really low cost solution which could deliver significant benefits in the reduction of particles, which have an improvement in air quality, and they would also have some climate benefits as well, which we could discuss maybe later in the Q&A. So next slide, please. Christina, over to you for the policy recommendations.
Thank you, and thank you, Carlos, for talking about our results in detail. So I think our policy recommendations are based on the fact that on the one hand, this problem is not only under research but also under regulated. So currently there is no legal limit for ultrafine particle levels, nor at the EU level, neither at the WHO level. The reason being, for instance, at the WHO level, is that there are only these sporadic measurements and that they are using different methodologies and metrics. Therefore, they are not comparable. Therefore, the WHO couldn't set up a legal limit for UFP levels. So this is a problem at I would say, the global level. In terms of the EU, there are some good signs in a sense that there is something called the Ambient Air Quality Directive, which in its recent review included now UFPs and defined airports as hotspots. So there will be some measurements at airports finally, but I think there is more to do, and therefore our first policy recommendation is to do the measurement and then, based on those data, introduce target values for UFP concentration levels around airports. Our second policy recommendation is about fuel quality. As Carlos explained, there is a direct link between the composition of fuel and the UFP emissions. Therefore, if we were to set a new EU jet fuel standard with lower aromatics and lower sulfur, we can address the problem as well from a jet fuel point of view. We also know that there are some operational measures, and I will, after we finish our presentation, I'm happy to give the floor to the colleagues in the call who can discuss more in detail that.
Oh, you just muted, Christina.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Got you, yeah.
Great. Okay. So to conclude, we know that our study is just a small contribution, but we think it was very important to highlight and the magnitude of the problem. We know that we only focused on one pollutant, and there is many more. We know that there are other groups that we did not focus this study on, mainly because of lack of data. We also know that there are more health conditions that are linked to exposure to UFP emissions, but as Carlos mentioned in his presentation, the links are not strong enough yet, so that we can have like a clear recommendation for that. Also to mention that the study focused on the 32 busiest airports in Europe, meaning that there are actually much more than those 51 million people in Europe who are impacted by regional airports and smaller airports as well. And as I mentioned, we focused on one, or let's say two solutions or two ways to address the problem from the regulatory point of view and from the jet fuel quality point of view. But there are other ways to address the same problem as well, and we would be also happy to learn more about those in detail, about the ground ops angle or the technological angle as well. Yeah, I can see Carlos. Is it you, Carlos?
I added, yeah, upon Finley's suggestion.
Would you like to?
It's just well, actually, I can give the floor here to Toller Finley to talk us through. But yeah, I think from our side, I think that was it with regards to the presentation of our study. So yeah, happy to take questions and basically to start a conversation around this study, around other measures also to reduce air pollution around airports, and maybe also to have a bit of a brainstorm of next steps. How do we move forward in increasing awareness on this topic and in accelerating the adoption of solutions?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, both of you. And yeah, Finley, would you like to to jump
Yeah,
in
just
on
before you
the last
stop
slide?
recording. Yeah,
Go
just
on.
before you stop recording. Apologies if the sound here isn't too good, but this is just, Transport Environment have suggested the two policies to do with fuel quality and to do with measuring emissions. And we just want to say, we are aware of a series of best practices of things we could do with today's technology to also reduce this. If I just kind of go a quick run round the circle, so you operate the most fuel efficient aircraft. Obviously, if you are you're running an aircraft that is more fuel efficient, you're going to get less emissions per unit of thrust of the aircraft, and there's going to be less pollution most likely. The next one, select engines with lean burn combustors. So this isn't necessarily about the fact they're newer, it's the type of combustor within the engine. This is sort of my speciality, gas turbines. Some engines are lean burn. That means they have a greater amount of oxygen in the combustor, and that means that you're going to get more complete combustion, and there's actually a lot lower levels of particulates that come out. Now, if you've got an Airbus A320 or Boeing 737, you can actually select an engine with lean burn or one without, and they might both meet the regulations, but one produces a lot less pollution. Optimizing flight paths, that's to do with whether you do a step descent or continuous descent, how steeply you go into the airport, you can burn more fuel, both in climb and in land and in descent. If you're doing a steeper flight path, you burn more fuel rather than coming gradually. But obviously, you've got conflicts with noise for people around the airport as well. Optimizing aircraft start and pushback. This is like using an electric tug rather than a diesel tug. It's also turning on one engine as late as possible or turning off the other engine as early as possible so that you just taxi on one engine and you don't have two engines producing pollution from both. There's also some manufacturers that have an electric tug. So I think I mentioned this one already, but yeah, rather than a diesel-powered vehicle pushing the aircraft backwards, forwards, electric. The next is reducing APU use. So APU stands for auxiliary power unit. It's like a small gas turbine that sits usually in the rear of the fuselage, and it means you shut both your engines down, but in order to get hotel power, which is what, the electrics and the air conditioning and the lights and stuff in the aircraft, that runs, but it's a very inefficient gas turbine compared to the other ones, and it produces very high levels of pollution. So if you can turn that off as soon as possible, that's really good. To do that, you can plug into ground power. Some airports do this, other ones don't, and some just depends where you are on the apron. You can also use electric support vehicles, so the fuel truck that comes in, the baggage handling, the water management, all of those trucks could be electrified really quickly as well. So these are all things that we could be doing to really drive down air pollution as low as possible without any new technology required, just being selective, and probably airports paying for it. And I think that's where work is coming to push for these things. So really interested in the discussion. That kind of segues quite nicely into people's experience of trying to push for some of these things, and how you've got on, including some of these improvements, but also maybe just monitoring and measuring the pollution in the first place. So we could stop the recording there and we could go into a discussion, and I'll let you lead that, Todd, if you want.
Yeah, thanks, Finn. Just to add to that, just before you stop recording, I think I was listening to one of our members, Sean's podcast on the Aerospace Ambition podcast, and I think I recall from that they were also talking about the potential for the electric tugs. If they had more electric tugs, potentially you could not only push back the aircraft from the stand, but you could also take the aircraft onto the taxiway, get it close enough to the runway holding point that you have enough time to heat up the engines and do the relevant checks before takeoff, but essentially just prolonging the time that the main engines are running as well as the APU on the ground. Obviously, what we saw in the study there with the greatest impact being obviously closer to the aircraft and engines. So clearly aviation workers are going to be bearing the brunt of this. But yeah, thanks so much for your time and contributions. And if we'll stop recording there and we'll start our Q&A.